Let's get into risk management today, and I'm sure you're just excited as I am to get even more into regulatory compliance documentation and spend even more time documenting your software instead of developing your software. So to recap super briefly, in the past, we actually were checking out this app called MindDoc by some other company, which I'm not affiliated with. And I think it's a pretty good example because, well, it's a real software on the market. Well, still on the market. Who knows how long this model of getting money for smartphone apps might work out. But regardless, it's an app for mental health. And in our example, we actually looked at what if this app would just be a pretty simple app treating depression. So for that, we actually went into our eQMS software called Formwork, which is the best software on the planet in the eQMS market. In my opinion, I'm biased. We wrote these two software requirements: regularly show a notification to the user and authenticate users. And again, we didn't document the entire software. I literally don't even have access to that software. This was just to show how does software documentation, how does the structure of software documentation actually look, and this is how it might look. So that was the IEC 60304, and I talked about that in all the prior videos, which I'll link below in the description. And today we want to talk about risk management and how risk management works. Now, the thing with risk management is that on the outside, it looks extremely complicated, but in my opinion, one of the main reasons for that is simply that there are many consultants in this area. They get paid by the hour, so they make more money if they spend a lot of time, many hours, explaining very complicated risk management to you. The reality, however, is, in my opinion, that it is pretty simple. And another good news is you might already have been doing this all the time at your company, because you usually tend to discuss what can go wrong in your software and how patients might get hurt. So the cool thing is actually you probably only have to document a lot of stuff which you already know. So you don't even need consultants for this, but you already probably have all the data in your head. So that's pretty cool. Now, we could start with our eQMS software, which I think is pretty great. But actually, let's today do something extremely radical and start in Google Sheets, because Google Sheets helps me explain the concept of risk management just a bit better before we actually dive into our eQMS software. Now, let's assume we have this smartphone app for treating depression. And one of the very obvious questions here is what could go wrong? And specifically, what could go wrong for patients? So maybe we just start writing those down and then kind of take it from there. So you have a column here, let's call it what could go wrong. And then you could say, okay, well, you're treating people with depression. So maybe you could have a worsening of depression. And why might that be the case? Maybe because you have crappy content in your app. Maybe your app has medical content, which is not very good medical content, and it gives advice to those patients to do certain things, and maybe that leads to worsening of their depression. Maybe wrong medical content in app, and then you have worsening of depression. What else could happen? So maybe you could have something of a stress reaction. Maybe someone is oh, I'm in this app, and maybe it crashes all the time, and then maybe, I don't know, I just feel worse. Someone gets stressed, maybe due to app crashes. Okay, so we've got that. One interesting aspect, which I think is actually now, because the standard of treatment for depression usually tends to be, okay, someone has to get a therapist appointment, which has a long waiting time, and then you have some therapy sessions. Now, maybe, and this is a bit of a constructed scenario, but I think it's quite an interesting one. If someone would actually have gone for therapy, but now downloads the app and thinks hey, screw therapy, I'll use the app first. But maybe the app is useless, and now they have an even longer wait time for therapy because they start searching for a therapist later. So maybe if something app is not useful. Oh, so patient doesn't search for therapist, replaces therapist with the app, but app is not useful. And then you have longer wait time before therapy, and a possible worsening of depression, right? Because like the patient waited for a longer time before getting treatment, and maybe depending on the like disease, but maybe with depression, this could mean like that the depression got worse in the meantime, which is pretty plausible. All right, so we have this list of like what could go wrong, but like what do you do with that? And intuitively, even without all this regulatory documentation stuff, usually the discussions I see in startups are like, well, you try to talk about these things and you kind of like mitigate them. So for example, you say like first, you say like how likely is this? So probability. And like, let's say this is actually really unlikely. I mean, you control the content in your app, so it is quite easy to get a medical person to review your content before you publish it. So let's say this is quite unlikely. And then like, okay, this is a bit more of a tricky one, right? So the app crashes repeatedly. That might not happen that often. And then someone gets stressed by app crashes. That might even happen even less often. So I'm not super sure what to put here, but like that's too unlikely. But you already noticed there's a complication here, right? Because you have a chained, like you have a sequential probability. You have like the probability of the app crashing, and then the probability of someone who gets exposed to app crashes reacting in a certain way to that. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And then like you have this final thing, like the patient doesn't search for a therapist, and then the app is not useful. This is a bit of a tricky one, but I would also, let's just for the sake of this exercise, say this is like possible. So it's kind of like a bit more likely than these unlikely scenarios. Okay, and then you also have something called, but then like only because something's like super likely doesn't necessarily mean it's like this is good or bad for your situation. It also depends on the medical harm actually, and how severe the medical harm is. So you have something called like severity. And then like we can actually see these two things here. They have the same medical outcome. So they have worsening of depression here. So regardless of what we decide, the content for the severity field should be the same for these two things, because in the end, the same thing happens on a medical level. So let's actually say this is like medium severity, because like worsening of depression, it can be quite, it's I guess like not something to take lightly, I suppose. Whereas this, maybe someone gets like a stress reaction, maybe let's just say this is not super bad. Let's say severity low. Okay. And then like now you have like a bit more data to kind of like look at this and say like, well, is this good or bad? And interestingly, I think we have all the data we needed, right? You have the probability and severity. So you could kind of like add a column and say like, is this acceptable? And you could kind of look at this and say like, okay, if something's unlikely and the severity is medium, maybe it's acceptable. You could like say maybe yes. If it's something's like unlikely and the severity is low, well, I mean, if this was acceptable, then this is acceptable too, because it's similar likelihood, but lower severity. But how about this one? Like if it happens like a bit more often and it has the same severity here, you might say maybe this is not acceptable. So how do you come up with these ideas? And this depends entirely on your company and on your product, and also to some degree your personal like risk profile based on the MDR, medical device classification, all the stuff you're aiming for. And there's unfortunately no like easy answer to this, but you kind of like determine what you deem acceptable or not. And in the next video, we'll actually take a look at how you define that in a very accurate way in your risk matrix. But for now, we've done like a very simple risk analysis, but this is not the end of it yet, right? Because you can't say like, hey, this is not acceptable. All right, let's still include the feature in the app and just ship it. So it's not that simple. And the next thing, which you probably also have already been doing at your company, is you've been checking or you've been adding additional features for things which might not have been acceptable. So for example, in this case, you could say like, maybe we should inform patients that that they can't replace their therapy sessions with the app, and that they should search for a therapy appointment in parallel while using the app. So you could actually say like, let's call this is actually called risk control. And maybe you might even say like, hey, these don't need risk control because like the risk was already acceptable here. But this one might need it because currently it's not acceptable. And you have different ways of like adding risk controls. And one way is like just displaying information to the user. So you could kind of like say like display. So we're going to show the user a text, whatever, notification or so that they should also, that this doesn't replace therapy and that they should also schedule therapy sessions in parallel. All right, so display hint to user that app doesn't replace therapy and so on. And then, of course, another question is like, is it acceptable now? And in this case, we would say yes. Okay, so for the sake of your time and my time, I will not go much further with the simple risk table. But I hope you kind of like got the idea, and you actually already have something to get started, right? Because you can already gather all the things which can go wrong in your software, and you can do like a very simple assessment. By the way, I probably wouldn't do this stuff yet on the right side, but like on the left side, you can definitely already come up with a list of things which can go wrong and their like implications and their medical implications down the line. That would be super useful. In the next few videos, we'll actually look how to document this in an even more structured ways so we actually achieve ISO 14971 compliance. But until then, you can start filling out this list and gathering some things. And as a quick primer, the number one thing which goes wrong in risk analysis is that people get too detailed, and especially consultants get too detailed because they get paid for going way too far into detail. So what you should aim for here is have 20 entries. I wouldn't have more than that. Some apps might even only have 2 or 3 or maybe 10, but you should definitely not have more than 20 entries in your risk table in the typical scenario of being like a software company which launches one software. So typically a startup launching an app, for example. All right, so get this done, and then we'll talk in the next video.